I enjoy Infinite Jest, which is a joke to many people that this book is just this monster and who would want to read that. I want to read it. Underworld by Don DeLillo is one of the best books I've ever read. And my thinking is I'm never enjoying something and thinking, damn, I wish there was less of this.
Hey, it's Demetria. As we close out 2024, we're looking back at our first year of Banner & Company. We have a wide range of folks on our podcast, talking all kinds of things, from law to gymnastics. But one thing we hope to find with this podcast and share with you are our commonalities. Now, there are a lot of them. One fun one that emerged this year, though, is that several of our guests are authors, new and old. With that in mind, this week we're bringing you a mini anthology of sorts, featuring some of our favorite book conversations. It's Banner & Company. Celebrated Nashville cookbook author Ann Byrne joined us in October to talk about her latest. It's called Baking in the American South. And just the handful of recipes we had time to talk about had my mouth watering.
The fried chicken, the coconut cakes, just a yellow cupcake with a buttermilk, kind of a homemade fudge buttermilk pan frosting, really. Like the cantaloupe cream pie recipe is called sticky lemon cake, croissants, biscuits, and banana pudding. Chocolate meringue pie, a chocolate macaroon, challah and babka, and marbled cakes. And lane cake, which is that bourbony, boozy, pecan and maraschino cherry confection Christmas cake.
See what I mean? But of course, talking about food means also talking about history, which made this conversation a real treat. Let's hear a little bit from that interview. What was your special dinner or dish growing up as a family? Were you from a great cook?
I was. I grew up here in Nashville. My mother was a great cook. She was the fifth of five daughters, but because of that, and she was born in 25, her mother didn't spend a lot of time in the kitchen with her. Her mother had to go back to work, and so my mother learned everything by herself. But she had really close friendships with her sisters, and they kept that throughout all their lives. But my mom was very creative. She made beautiful food. Again, nobody taught her to cook. She just loved color. She just would decorate food. She would carve watermelon baskets. I mean, I grew up with that, homemade cinnamon rolls. So I had a lot of really rich food memories growing up that I know fueled my career.
And what were great Nashville specialties of your childhood?
Oh, wow. Back then it was fried chicken, and she served it with rice, which was very now and so low country or so New Orleans. Where did that come from? But it was great, fried chicken and rice and some sort of green vegetable, green beans, peas, white gravy over the rice, chicken gravy, homemade biscuits or homemade yeast rolls, and always a pie. I mean, I grew up here in Nashville. We had probably had homemade pies 3 or 4 times a week. Chocolate meringue pie, lemon meringue pie, banana cream pie, coconut cream pie, all of the cream pies. We had them all. And it was just, my mother loved pie. She loved to make meringue. She thought it was beautiful. So she was a really talented cook who nobody had ever taught. But she could tell. Actually, she told me something once. She said, I can tell what a recipe tastes like just by looking at it.
Looking at the finished product.
By reading the recipe. Just
by reading the
looking
words.
She goes, I can taste that recipe just by looking at it. And I think it's really true. I think when you love to cook and you like food and you like to read cookbooks, you hit on a recipe that it just sounds good and you can taste it.
What's the best Nashville recipe in this book?
I'm glad you asked that question because it has definitely been on my mind. I believe that in the past, going back, Nashville probably had through Satsuma Tea Room and some other old places. There was also a restaurant called Kleeman's in the 1940s. So I'd say my favorite Nashville recipe is the cream chicken on egg bread. because it is uniquely Nashville. I have not seen that anywhere else. The idea that you could cook this whole chicken, take it off the bone, and use the stock to make this really yummy sauce with cream in it, and then you put the chicken back in, and then you serve this creamed chicken over a very eggy cornbread, a square of real eggy cornbread. And it is the most delicious thing. I have made it for friends who come in for dinner. It's the most delicious thing because it's cornbread, but it's kind of like a souffle. It's almost like spoon bread as well. It's very wet and eggy and delicious, and then you've got this cream chicken. And that was one of my mother's favorite recipes, and she had it written on a card. And I also have found it in the Nashville cookbook, which was written by the Home Economics Association here many years ago. So I love that. I do think that variations of chess pie are very Nashville, especially if they have vinegar and cornmeal in them, because that is uniquely to this area. You see chess pie in other parts of the South, but often there will be flour in a recipe and not cornmeal. But the use of cornmeal in a pie recipe tells you that that's what they had access to. And although that's kind of a hard scrabble kind of recipe too, it really kind of is more like the mountains, where you see vinegar used in baking recipes instead of lemon juice because the people of the mountains have had no access to fresh fruit or lemons.
Wow. I confess, I looked at chess pie the first time it was served to me. I had no idea what the heck it was. It was cloyingly sweet. It was just too sweet for me.
I agree.
Is that an acquired taste, or are there variations on the sweetness of chess?
I think that it's typical of everybody now. We taste a lot of old Southern recipes, and they are too sweet. And I do say that in the book, and I take that in consideration. I reduced the sugar in the Nashville chess pie. I also added both cornmeal and flour, because I think the consistency you get, the filling is less likely to separate when cornmeal does not thicken, it does not hold a custard mixture together. It doesn't have the gluten in it that wheat flour does. So knowing what I know about baking now, I was able to take a grandmother's recipe and half cornmeal, half flour, but still use the apple cider vinegar and get that tang that I like from a chess pie and reduce the sugar. And also it may have a smidge of salt. Believe that our ancestors would have been baking. If they baked with butter, they would have used salted butter. And I think that kind of gets lost in modern day recipes because we try to make them and we're using unsalted butter and something's kind of flat and missing or it tastes too sweet. Use the salt, use about a half a teaspoon of salt per stick of butter to really bring up the flavor. It's fascinating. And then I think our palates today are less sweet. We don't want things that's sweet. And I removed sugar in a chocolate meringue pie recipe from the Delta in Mississippi because I felt like the filling was sweet, the meringue was sweet. They didn't need to both be sweet. So I took 6 tablespoons of sugar out of the filling, kept it in the meringue, which needs to be sweet, and it was the perfect balance.
We're talking about books this week, but we do live in Music City, so it's no surprise that we're not only home to great musicians, but also great music writers. NPR music critic Ann Powers joined us back in June to talk about her latest book, Traveling, On the Path of Joni Mitchell. Let's start with Ann reading a passage from that book, which takes an unconventional approach to the biography of a powerhouse woman musician.
You're hearing me flap the cover of the book here. Okay. It's never easy to watch the heroes of our youth grow old. Not only does their aging put the ultimate loss, that is mortality, clearly in sight, the process itself is a series of little murders. The ideals embodied by the young and those in the prime of life, quickness and nerve, the magnificent aplomb that grows with each accomplishment, grow shaky as the body gives in. I hadn't been besotted with Joni in my own callow years, but I'd come to treasure the 25-year-old who had lugged her guitar through Colorado Canyon, and the 32-year-old who commandeered the open road, and the 48-year-old who raised her arms in love and wisdom even after many struggles and said, "Come in from the cold." Every one of those Jonies was her own person above all else. She welcomed acclaim at every stage, but mostly she wanted to keep heading somewhere else, never to rest at the front of a receiving line, and to never let others define her, even in adoration. Even though I knew from those spending time with her that she still ran her own show as best she could, the new soft face she was showing the world disconcerted me. So, do you want me to go on?
Yeah, well, no, that's great.
Yeah.
Because that spoke to me so much as a person my age.
Exactly.
That there isn't, especially with a creative person, there is more to the path.
No, absolutely. And what I'm expressing in that section is my kind of mixed feelings about my joy at her comeback, but my mixed feelings in that she is a different Joni now.
Yeah.
I'm sure your listeners know she suffered an aneurysm in the mid-2010s, and she's worked back from that. And it's an incredible story of healing, amazing, and healing through music with the help of her friends, and foremost Brandi Carlile, who's helped her so much. And it's been amazing to watch. But yeah, sure, sometimes when I'm watching this current Joni, all of her recent appearances, I'm like, man, I just want that prickly Joni to say something, or to, I don't know. It's very unfair to say this, but, I'd love to hear the acrobatic notes of her youth when she could hit those high notes. But I'll say this also for her. Her musical intelligence is so strong that she's figured out how to bring that nuance into
a new range.
Yeah. And that's incredible. Even just the timing that she uses in delivering songs now, it's still genius.
I know. I was watching the Gershwin Prize show that was, just brilliant. I loved all the interpretations and stuff. And a friend of mine, a good musical friend of mine, said, "Yeah, but I don't like the low Joni."
Well,
It's
that
like-
person needs to spend a little time
Exactly.
with Travelogue, with the recordings Joni made in the early 2000s, where she was already offering us this voice, this smoky voice. I see the smoky voice, the true alto, as a culmination of a lot of things, and in a strange way, as a way that she can live out her very early musical fantasies, like before she even got into folk music, when she was growing up and listening to jazz that her dad was playing in the house, and that torch song Joni is as true a Joni as any other.
Yeah. I mean, that's why this is such a great book, because there's so many ways to look at one person.
Well, thank you. I think this is, there have been similar books. Actually, there was a book years ago published about Jimi Hendrix by Charles Shaar Murray called Crosstown Traffic. Some of the books about Bob Dylan take this similar approach, trying to look at an artist from many different angles. So I am glad, however, initially when I was writing the book, I sort of was inclined to write it almost as a series of essays, not chronological, but I'm very glad my editor was like, no, make it chronological too. My agent also said that, because I think you have to have that narrative through line to, as a reader, to just keep pulling you through. And then we can see how, for her, as with many of our greatest artists, all the different personas and personalities emerge over time and are connected to each other as well. You say something similar about Dylan, I think, or even about someone like Paul McCartney or Mick Jagger. He's kind of stayed the same.
Well,
All
Paul
power
Simon.
to him,
I just watched the new Paul Simon.
Yeah, or Paul Simon, these artists that we have who've lived long lives, or even, artists of my generation like a Tori Amos, or PJ Harvey, one of my favorite artists of all time, who's constantly reinventing herself and constantly giving us new sides of her genius. I so appreciate that from artists.
It's Banner and Company. I'm Demetria Kalodimos. We'll be right back. If you're interested in building a more thriving and inclusive community by turning thoughtful generosity into positive change, well, you might want to know about one of our sponsors here at Banner & Company, the Community Foundation of Middle Tennessee. It matches compassionate givers with worthy causes in ways that benefit all of us. Check them out at cfmt.org. In July, Nashville historian Betsy Phillips published Dynamite Nashville. A little side note, she also wrote a detailed backstory of the Banner, warts and all, that I do hope you'll read if you haven't already. We'll link it in the web post for this episode. Well, Betsy joined us to talk about her book, the many, many records requests that went into it, and the questions she still can't answer after years of research.
The main thing I'm trying to do is solve 3 integration era bombings that happened here in Nashville. Hattie Cotton's school was blown up in September 1957. Then the Jewish Community Center was blown up in March 1958. And then probably most famously, the home of Councilman Z. Alexander Luby was blown up in April of 1960. So those are the 3 bombings that I mainly focus on. But as you know, throughout the book, it expands to kind of look at this whole network of bombers who are working together throughout the South.
And all of those crimes still classified in 2024 as unsolved.
Right. Yeah, and that's really one of the heartbreaking things to me, is that every time the Justice Department opens up a civil rights era cold case and is like, shrug, well, there's no one left to talk to, Ed Fields is still alive. Like, it's just not true that there's no one left to talk to. And as I say in the book, like now that he's in his 90s, it might not do any good to talk to him. But 20 years ago, or even 40 years ago, they had a resource who could have given them information, and they didn't use it. So that is really, to me, like one of the frustrating things is kind of that the lie is perpetuated. That, oh, well, we can't know what happened. There's no one left. Like, well, it's kind of your job is to find out what happened. For me, like, obviously there can't be justice, but we should at least have the truth. That should be something that the Justice Department and the FBI, they should give us.
And there might be children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren who know well the people in these pages.
Yes, yeah.
And are having a hard time with it, but could supply information.
Right, exactly. Well, this is one of the most kind of frustrating things about Nashville is, people whose families are from here, they have been here for a long time. And yet if you go to the civil rights room at the library, they know every Black person in those photos. If you haven't been to the civil rights room at the library, they have giant blown up photos from the Banner hanging around the room. And they know the identities of every Black person in those photos because people come in and they're like, that's my grandpa, or, oh, that was my neighbor so-and-so, or whatever. Like, Black people know the Black people in those photos. And there must also be the equivalent of white people who would know who the white people in those photos are. But the last time that I talked to Elliot Robinson at the Civil Rights Room about this, he said no white person has ever come in to identify anybody. And this really hurts our ability to know what happened and why, or how this was decided, and, who was involved. And certainly I understand the great amount of shame that there might be around this, but this is one of the ways to, alleviate that shame by, taking a stand to be on the right side by saying, yeah, I know this person, or my mom went to church with this person, or whatever it is. No one's going to be prosecuted. Everyone's dead. Again, it's just a matter of, the city deserves the truth.
Shortly after Dynamite Nashville was published and we ran this interview, Mayor Freddie O'Connell announced that he was asking the MNPD to reopen the investigation into the Luby bombing. One fun fact is that we have authors on our own staff, including the producer of this podcast, Steve Haruch, and our criminal justice reporter, Stephen Hale. Just as he joined our staff, he published a book about a place that I know well, Tennessee's Death Row, or as the regulars call it, simply Unit 2. Stephen's book paints a complex and compassionate portrait of the people who spend time there, both the incarcerated and those who visit. Here's a bit of our conversation from the release event for Death Row Welcomes You at Parnassus Books.
The passage I'm going to read, though, is a part of the chapter where I talk about the first time that I went to visit Death Row with a man named David Bass, who I think is here somewhere. There he is. And Al Andrews, who had invited me into this peculiar world. And actually, the way that I met, real quick to set this up, the way that I met David is through Demetria. I talk about in the book that I was covering the lawsuit over Tennessee's lethal injection protocol and ran into Demetria there at the courthouse, and Demetria was in between journalism jobs at the time, and so it was, I wasn't expecting...
in civilian clothes.
Yes, I wasn't expecting to see her there, exactly. And I suppose I had mentioned to you that I was trying to get in touch with some of these guys on death row as these executions were approaching to try to get a comment from them or let them say something if they wanted to. And Demetria just very casually said, well, I visit out there. I could try to help you out with that. And I did not know what you meant by that. It turned out that she meant that she had gotten to know a man on death row for a few years, that she had gotten to know all these other folks who had gotten to know people on death row, and that it would be no problem at all for me to go out there with them. And so that's what I ended up doing. And this passage is about the first night that I did that. So, the death row visitation gallery looked something like a small indoor bus station or the waiting room at a dystopian doctor's office. An arrangement of blue and red chairs connected in groups of 2 and 3 were surrounded by off-white concrete walls and overseen by a large convex mirror hanging near the ceiling. In a corner near the entrance, there was a microwave and a cooler of water with a stack of small cups. Nearby, a small shelf held items for children, puzzles, games, and Mr. Potato Head. We just walked in when a man emerged from a door toward the back of a room wearing a white t-shirt and beige Tennessee Department of Correction issued pants. It was Terry King. He was 56 years old then, with a bald head, a gray goatee, and skin paled by more than 35 years without sunlight. He walked toward us, reached his hand into a manila envelope he was carrying, revealing its contents with a smile. I brought popcorn. Terry knew I was a reporter, but I'd agreed not to write about the visit for the paper. We all understood that, given the prison's aversion to granting media access, a story like that could get me banned from visiting and possibly have repercussions for David and Terry as well. I knew of Terry from what I'd heard from David and gleaned from a brief Google search. The latter informed me that in 1983, during a drunken and drug-fueled summer when he was 21 years old, Terry had participated in 2 Knoxville area murders. The first took place in early July, when Terry and a friend named Joe Sexton met Todd Millard, a 20-year-old soldier on leave from Fort Knox. Terry and Joe spent most of the night drinking and playing pool with him. Later, they robbed Todd before Joe shot him to death. It was several weeks later that Terry committed the murder for which he was sentenced to death. Drunk again and high on Quaaludes, Terry and his cousin were cruising around the Cherokee Reservoir east of Knoxville when they met a 31-year-old housewife named Diana Smith. The chance meeting led to a night of partying, more drugs, sex, and cruising. At some point, Diana looked at Terry and said, "Why did you all rape me?" Panicking, he met up with his friend Joe, who gave him a rifle, and the two drove out to a wooded area with Diana in the trunk. Terry shot her, and later, he and Joe dumped her body in a quarry lake. There was more to the stories, but those were the blunt facts, and Terry did not dispute them. Now, 35 years later, he was greeting me on death row with a bag of popcorn. We sat close in the hard plastic chairs, our knees nearly touching. The room filled up with around 15 or 20 people, and we leaned in closer to hear each other as voices and laughter bounced off the concrete walls. We talked without any particular aim, David and Al and Terry catching me up a bit, and Terry sharing bits and pieces about ourselves as we went. Later, when I told him about my newborn daughter, who was sweet and healthy but still crying all through the night, his face softened, and he told me how lucky I was. After more than 3 decades in prison, he said he could not even summon the sound of a crying baby in his mind. I didn't ask him about the murders that night, but his address was on death row, and that fact hung in the air between us. He referenced the time he got in trouble, and more than once he urged me to ask him anything at all. It took him years, he said, to truly reckon with who he'd been and what he'd done. A breakthrough had come in 2011, almost 30 years after he went to prison, when he read William Paul Young's international best-selling novel, The Shack, and became a professing Christian. Years later, the author had come to meet Terry at the prison, and they kept in touch by writing letters. Terry told me he hated who he'd been, but that he loved who he'd become. As he told me these things, it did not seem like he was trying to convince me of his redemption so much as he was claiming it for himself. The state, he said, wanted to strap him to his past. They want to kill the man who did those things, he said, but they killed him a long time ago when they sent me here.
We all come to the doors of Unit 2 with our upbringing and with our personal feelings. Tell us a little bit about your upbringing and your attitudes towards capital punishment before and perhaps if they've changed after.
Yeah, I write a little bit about this in the introduction to the book, but I don't really feel like I had a opinion about the death penalty when I was young, or at least this is not something that my mom's here. This is not something we talked about in our house. When I was growing up, we didn't talk about the death penalty. I remember when Timothy McVeigh was executed, because I remember seeing his face on the newspaper, and but I don't. At a certain point, I recall feeling strongly that killing people who had killed people didn't make sense, and I did a high school, class project to that effect. But yeah, I don't think I really inherited a strong opinion on this. I was raised in a Christian home and in a Christian church, and which has maybe a lot of different connotations depending on your experience. But for me, a big thing that I always carried with me was the idea that of grace and redemption, and that these things were possible, that they were good to pursue yourself, and they were good to offer to other people, and that that an earth as it is in heaven wouldn't necessarily include killing people for their crimes. So, I think that has stuck with me in that way as it relates to the death penalty. And then once I started writing about this stuff is when I really, I think, developed more of a view about the ins and outs of it and sort of the way that we carry it out here,
It's Banner and Company. We'll be right back. Journalist Jared Sullivan spent 5 years reporting on the aftermath of the Kingston coal ash spill. The disaster at a TVA power plant in East Tennessee saw 1 billion tons of toxic coal ash break free of a retaining wall and inundate the countryside. Jared's book, Valley So Low, follows attorney Jim Scott, who fought on behalf of crew members who became sick after working on the cleanup. It also tells the stories of some of those workers and the loved ones who watched them fall ill. Yes, it's a legal thriller, but it's anything but clinical. I asked him how he made these stories come to life.
I'll say nothing's imagined. Everything is based in fact. I tried to write in scene, meaning, just like you've seen a movie, a character walks in the room, they have a conversation, they leave, and I tried to give the readers clear images to follow. So I didn't want this to read like a policy paper. I did not want to read like, I don't know. I want to be dynamic and vivid. So it was a lot of long interviews with people, and it was like, okay, where do you have? It's very basic. Where do you have this conversation? Where are you standing in the room?
What did you eat?
Cars are a good one because people always remember it's very easy to remember what car you had in a certain year. So like, what car did you drive there? That's an easy one. I went to all these offices too, and did
you take pictures?
Oh yeah, tons of pictures at all these places. And then how else would I do it? Gosh, like old photos. The lawyers were really good they wrote on whiteboards a lot, and took photos of them afterwards just to have, so like we can remember what we talked about. And so the lawyers turned over a lot of those to me. So it's very easy. I could reconstruct scenes that they turned over I guess they sent me screenshots of like their meeting calendars, right? So you can know, okay, I know this happened on this date. You guys have this on your calendar. So, it's just like, Robert Caro, who wrote The Power Broker and all these long LBJ biographies, he's a master at reconstructing scenes like that. So I listened to a lot of interviews with him about how he did it, and it feels silly to interview a sick worker, especially, and be like, okay, I know you are dying, but like, let me ask you about like what you had. Did you have toast for breakfast that morning, or it feels very, very silly. It can feel silly because the story's so big and so urgent,
but it's also so humanizing and intimate. You understand the character better if you can sit in their living room.
I have to explain that. Yeah, it's like it really helps the reader form a picture in their mind, and I ultimately care about the people more if they have these kind of details. So, that's why I really want this book to be character driven and not a wonky book about U.S. energy policy or even the history of TV. I do get into the history of TVA in a few pages, but I didn't really want it to be that. I want it to be a character-driven narrative, because I thought I'm not going to get people to care about coal ash just by telling you about like how hazard it is. Like, we know there's just hazards in a lot of stuff. I wanted readers to love the characters. Yeah, I feel like that's the only way to get people to care about some of these environmental issues is put the character first.
I was surprised with how much they shared. You must have spent a lot of time with Jim Scott and with the other fellow Ansel and his wife.
Hours. Hundreds of interviews over 5 years. The pandemic ended up actually being good for me in the sense that Jim had nothing to do, really. Once the pandemic hit, he was just at home all the time and not running around taking his kids and stuff or working cases. So we talked every night during the pandemic for weeks. It was long, painstaking work, but I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed getting to know him as a character. I think he's kind of like a Huck Finn character a little bit. Like, he's kind of a knucklehead, and I show in the book he does not, he made some unwise choices here and there. He has his problems, but at the end of the day, like, he has a good heart, I think. And that's what I kind of love in characters. I think that's why Huck Finn is so memorable, because, he means well, even though he doesn't quite always do the right thing. So
you think you'll stick in the environmental realm?
This book to me felt important because it's about everyday Tennesseans, but it's also about like a much bigger topic that matters to all of us, and it's energy. We need more of it, and we need to be clean. So it feels like a very important topic. So I think if I do another book, I want it to have a similar kind of weight to it. I want it to matter. And I got to find the right characters too. Something I've listened to like way too much, it's like deeply ingrained in my mind, is William Faulkner's, when he won the Nobel Prize in 1950 something. He has this great speech it's directed at writers, his acceptance speech. And this was at the height of the Cold War. He talks about, we live under this, we live in fear. He says like the core thing, the basis of all things is to be afraid. And learning that the writer must forget it forever, and only focus on the verities. That's a great old word. The verities and old truths of the heart, like pity and compassion and sacrifice, and it lists a few other things. And that's what I loved about this story. It was a story of courage and pity and sacrifice. Those old truths of the heart. So I've got, my next book has to have those things too. That's what attracted me to this to this story. These people gave Jim Scott, I mean, like I said, he wrecked his whole life for this case. And these workers, it was hell for them too. They were getting sick, but also having to show up to court to move this case forward. So they also sacrificed a lot. So yeah, it was a moving experience for me. These people are amazing people. Yeah, so my next book, I don't know. I'm gonna spend a long time looking. I'm not rushing at anything. My wife just made me swear to take a year off from writing and reporting.
All right, now for another author who can reconstruct history in a vivid way, using every detail he can get his hands on. The breakout podcast, Cocaine and Rhinestones, dives deep, and I mean really deep, into the culture and lore of country music. The second season focuses on the relationship between two icons, George Jones and Tammy Wynette. Tyler Mahan Coe is the host, and he adapted Season 2 into a book, also called Cocaine and Rhinestones. Back in October, he stopped by to talk about it and why he thinks that short attention spans have been greatly over-exaggerated. Let's talk about the book. It is doorstop sized. Did you know it was going to be that thick? But in a great way. And the chapters, in my opinion, aren't too long. It's a great pick up, put down, review, revisit book.
Yeah, I am aware that this is a large book. However, my personal taste in books runs big. Like, some of my favorite books are gigantic. I enjoy Infinite Jest, which is a joke to many people that this book is just this monster and who would want to read that. I want to read it. Underworld by Don DeLillo is one of the best books I've ever read. And my thinking is, I'm never enjoying something and thinking, damn, I wish there was less of this, you know?
Right.
It's, if you like it, then here's a lot of it. And I also certainly didn't decide I'm going to write a big book and then figure out how to fill all of this space that I arbitrarily chose. It's as big as it needs to be, you know, to get everything done. And then it is adapted from the second season of the podcast. There's a lot of stuff that was cut from the second season. I think of myself as more of a researcher and editor than a writer. I have a couple tricks up my sleeve as a writer, and I think I know when to pull them out. But I know that I am a good editor, and I know what needs to be cut and like what doesn't actually need to be here. So when it came time to turn the podcast into a book, there was a lot of stuff that instantly I knew that doesn't need to be here, that doesn't need to be here. And we could really focus on the George Jones and Tammy Wynette aspect of everything by paring it down.
The back of the book credits you with the War and Peace of country music podcasts. Do you like that description? I think it's apt.
I've never read that book, so I can't say. It's specifically Moby Dick is much more of a conscious touch point for me with this aspect of it. And as far as my general approach, maybe, but again, I haven't read it. I mean, I'll take it, you know. People seem to think that book is important, so.
Sure. When did you encounter Moby Dick?
Well, my grandmother taught me how to read before kindergarten, so I have always read for pleasure. It wasn't much of a homework assignment attachment to reading for me. So when my parents realized that I enjoyed reading as a child, they would get me I don't even know what they're called, but like abridged classics or something, where it's children's versions of the classics. Mm-hmm. So certainly that would have been the first version of Moby Dick that I came across. And it wouldn't have had any of the, you know, tangential stuff that everyone associates with Moby Dick in reality. But just the framework of the actual whaling ship portion of that narrative was always fascinating to me for the same reasons that it is fascinating to everyone, you know.
Yeah. So you're a very early reader. Would you consider yourself sort of a late bloomer as a writer?
No, I've always been a writer, but not knowing it. Writing something down has always been the way that I process it or learn it. Once I have written something down, I'm going to remember it. Like if it was important enough to work it out in that way. And then I also kept journals for a long time when I was on tour. But none of that was ever done with the thought that it would be presented to anyone else, you know. So it's always just been a thing that I've done and been practicing without realizing I was practicing it.
By hand, or do you type?
Both, yeah. Just sometimes when I'm working on the show, I need to type at a computer because I have a gigantic database of notes.
Yeah.
But also, when I was journaling, that was all by hand. So it just depends on what's being written, I guess.
Yeah, thank God for copy and paste. What would we do without it?
I think about that all the time with every aspect of making this podcast. I have no idea how I have no idea how Moby Dick got written. That's mind-blowing to me.
Yep. We've been told that people have such short attention spans these days, and the appetite is for quick bites. Everything you produce debunks that.
I disagree with all of the people who have the most money, and it's a stupid thing to do if you would like them to give you some of your money for your work. But I also have been around a lot of bitter old men in the entertainment industry on the artist side of things who listened to all of the people with money, and even if it worked, even if the best case scenario situation is what they found themselves in, they then spent the rest of their lives performing an act that they have no emotional or spiritual or intellectual connection to for an audience that they would not have and maybe don't appreciate because that audience is there to see something that this artist didn't want to do in the first place. So my philosophy has always been go down with the ship that you want to be on.
Yeah. Trust your gut, I guess.
Yeah, worst case scenario, I did what I wanted to do, you know.
Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in the new year with fresh episodes and some new questions for our fishbowl. Banner & Company is a production of the New Nashville Banner. Our producers are Steve Haruch and Andrea Tudhope. Original music is by Verlin Thompson. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or go to NashvilleBanner.com. You're in good company.